Well, if you can believe it, we have found our way back to Romans one more time. For 5 years now, we have been coming back to this letter and taking a few chapters at a time to work our way through the letter and give it the treatment it really deserves. This is a huge letter with a lot going on. Paul has a lot to say to us. This year, we are going to finish off chapters 13, 14, 15, 16. But that meant that we started in chapter 13, which is a really difficult passage to wrap our heads around because it's a passage that has been used badly throughout history. You can catch up on the sermon. We'll put the link below, and you can check out some of the ways that we walked through some of the history of terrible interpretations of this passage and how it has been weaponized against the vulnerable. But one of the quotes that I read came from Contemporary Times, pastor in the United States, talking about this particular passage in Romans, and he said, and I'll quote here, "The book of Romans is very clear. God has endowed rulers full power to use whatever means necessary, the authority to do whatever, whether it is assassination, capital punishment, or evil to quell the actions of evildoers." Now, when he was asked, well, what about a page earlier in Romans 12 when Paul says, "Do not repay evil for evil," he replied, well, that does not apply. That is for Christians. This is for leaders. As if what we have here is a situation where God can use people to do things that God would never sanction one of God's followers to do. It's like a loophole for God. He can use bad people to do bad things, and it just seems incoherent. But here's the really difficult part about Romans 13. That interpretation, that leaders can do whatever they want and it is God's will if they do it, is not actually mangling the text of Romans 13 all that badly. You can actually get that meaning out of those words just by taking them at face value. You really don't have to stretch them that much. This is one of the really difficult things when it comes to the Bible in general, but particularly when we read Paul. Because the position from which we read the words is just as important as the words on the page. Here's what I mean by that. When we read from the perspective of the Roman Empire, or from the perspective of the American Empire, from the perspective of white middle-class suburbanites who have all the power and the privilege in our world, it comes off as if Paul is saying something pretty straightforward here. Play by the rules, follow the laws, and you will be fine. Don't, and you get what you deserve. But of course, that's not who Paul is writing to. Paul is writing to a small community living in the shadow of a hostile authority. This is a small, persecuted community. And no, it's true. Persecution in the 50s, when Paul is writing, is not widespread. It's not systematic. Not everyone is being hunted down for being a Christian at that point in history. But that makes it all the more meaningful. Because what Paul is really saying here is to a community that's living on the margins, keep your head down. Play by the rules as best you can, and don't expose yourself needlessly to violence. Romans 13 was never meant to be a weapon for the powerful to wield. It was always advice intended for life on the margins. Those communities, those people who were afraid and had good reason to be. Those people who wanted to make sure that they could fly below the radar, not draw more attention to themselves, that maybe the powers that be would create just enough space for their lives to flourish and them to love their neighbors and live in the peace of Christ. And so when we read scriptures, particularly Paul, who is writing to very specific times and places in history, we have to situate ourselves within the audience that is receiving these words. Because again, the place from which we read is as important as the words on the page. And the same words being said to a community who's on the margins, afraid from their safety, read very differently than the same words as if they were coming to those of us who live within the empire and have all of the power of it at our disposal. And so what I wanted to do was show you the clip of me talking in the sermon where I took a targum. In the ancient days, one of the ways that the Christian community would keep the scriptures alive and meaningful for them was was to interpret and reinterpret them for their time. And Targums were not really translations, they were ways of updating the language and making it resonate with a particular audience in a particular time. Sylvia Keesmaat and Brian Walsh have done an incredible job recreating Targums for all of Romans in their book, Romans Disarmed. It's a new book, it's just out, I've read it, it is fabulous if you're at all interested in a scholarly approach to a historic reading of Romans. And by all means, track this book down. We will put a link in the comments below. But here you will see my reading of Romans 12 and 13, really lifted from the work of Walsh and Keesmaat, put into my own language a little bit for time here. But it's a way, an attempt to make this passage make sense as if we were that audience who was first receiving it. And maybe as you hear this, you will hear Paul's voice coming in new ways to you, speaking to you about new ways you can imagine yourself standing alongside in solidarity with your neighbors who may not feel the same safety that you do all the time. Dear friends, in dangerous times like these, remember this always. Do not be overrun by evil, but instead choose to overcome evil with good. For you are more than conquerors. And peace is, in the end, far more powerful than war. Reconciliation surpasses revenge, and generous hospitality, it can disarm even the worst enmity. But what about this empire that surrounds us? Those principalities and powers that threaten to overwhelm us, the menace of violence that looms over us all the time. Can we really be obedient to Christ in one moment and then to the war machine of the state in the next? Now, here's my word to you. The state has no authority in itself. All the power it seems to wield comes only from the very Christ its violence betrays. And so while we grant no ultimate authority to the state, we should be wise around it. It does, after all, bear the sword, and though it may present itself as benevolent, the taser guns and stun grenades, the tear gas and the lethal force, they all come out pretty quickly, especially if you don't look like them. So choose your battles wisely. And please don't expose your vulnerable neighbors needlessly. Power should be feared, as long as we don't allow fear the last word. And so we live alongside all of these earthly authorities, but we subject them always to Jesus the Messiah. All judicial rulings, all constitutions, all executive orders, all subject to the law of love. A law rooted in this radical tradition of Torah, a law that supersedes all those who grasp at power. For this is how the gospel undermines, subverts, and transforms the very foundations of the world. That all laws be subject to this law, Christ's love. The scriptures are never messages that were meant to be weaponized against the marginalized. They were always stories meant to draw us together, to help us see things from new perspectives, to help us love the way that Christ's love.